Good afternoon. Would all of you please stand for our invocation to be led by Dr. Craig McMahon, our university minister, and please remain standing following the invocation for our opening hymn, Lift Every Voice.
Would you join me in prayer, please? Oh God, we gather in this historic setting to commemorate what happened on our campus 50 years ago, when the long arc of the moral universe finally bent towards justice. We've come to celebrate, but first we must confess complicity, or at least acquiescence, to the prevailing darkness of fear and ignorance that made the long arc toward justice even longer and pushed back against the dawning of a new day. We confess that while some raised their voices against the inhumanity of segregation, others ranted in its favor, and many, many more remained appallingly silent. We confess that while some acted courageously to ignite change, others resisted, stubbornly defending the status quo, and many, many more simply watched from the sidelines. We confess and repent of the evil that was done and the good that was left undone. Today we do celebrate the daring dreamers who changed the world and changed our campus. With their own bare hands, they bent steel bars of injustice into open doors of opportunity. They fought heroically so there would be a place for everyone at the bountiful welcome table of this great land and this great university. They each in their own way had been to the mountain, where their eyes were opened to a vision of the beloved community, and their hearts were set on fire with a holy calling to do something about it. They marched in the streets, they rode in buses, they sat in protest, and they stood up to the powers that be. They took risks and made sacrifices to do what is right. And because they did, old walls of hostility and separation started coming down, and the dawn of a hope-filled new day began to rise. But you know, O God, and we know that we are not there yet. The sun of opportunity still hangs low on the horizon for too many. They may have a seat at the welcome table, but their bowl is empty. So on this day of celebration, we ask that you raise up a new generation of daring dreamers, even those who are gathered here. Call them up to the mountain to gain their sight, and then send them into the valleys to serve the suffering. Through these young champions of sacred justice, may the dream be realized, the promise kept, the hope fulfilled, and the journey finished. Amen.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. We're facing the rising sun of a new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat, have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. We have come over a way that with tears have been watered. We have come, treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out of the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
You may be seated.
The year was 1963. It was a tumultuous time. The civil rights movement was gaining traction. It was in August of that year that a prophet from Atlanta shared with us his dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners would be able to sit down together at a table of brotherhood. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was sharing this dream on the Mall in Washington, D.C., two private universities in Georgia were proposed to take a step that was unprecedented in the Deep South. Emory University in Atlanta and Mercer University in Macon were about to begin voluntarily integrating their student bodies without being under any legal compulsion to do so. On September 20th, 1963, 50 years ago to this day, the first 3 black students admitted to Mercer University officially enrolled: Sam Oney, Benny Stevens, and Cecil Dewberry. Over the past several months, alumni, trustees, students, faculty, and staff from throughout the university have been engaged in thoughtful planning to ensure a meaningful commemoration of the 50th anniversary of this watershed moment in the history of our university. I'd like to begin today by publicly recognizing and thanking these individuals who are listed in your program for investing their time, energy, and ideas into the planning of what will be a year-long observance. If you are a member of the 50th Anniversary Planning Committee, please stand at this time and allow us to thank you for your efforts. We're fortunate that many of those who played significant roles in the events here at Mercer in 1963 are still with us: faculty, administrators, students, trustees, and community members. We have recorded interviews with witnesses to and participants in the events that we commemorate today. They can certainly tell the story better than I because they lived the story. At this time, we'd like to share with you a few segments from the interviews with these witnesses and participants, as well as a few others. So let's see the video.
Dr. Harris, and this was Dr. Harris, he told his board that we were running. And he said, when reminded that we were private, we didn't have to integrate, he said, it is the right thing to do. And that was the end of it.
Dr. Harris had just decided this was something that, ought to happen. And then our minister in Macon, Dr. Walter Moore, Vineville Baptist Church, he was on the Board of Trustees, and he, was for our admitting, black students.
5 trustees walked out of the meeting, and there was tension and hard feelings, but the great majority of the trustees, with Rufus Harris as president, voted in favor of the resolution.
My father, in his editorial with the Christian Index, which was quite a controversial stand at the time, said it's the Christian thing to do. And if Mercer would not admit a Baptist convert, he said we should shut down the foreign mission programs and close our doors and go out of business.
The Mercer campus, as I recall, it was sort of us against that particular frame of mind. As I look back on it, I don't recall a single faculty member or student who was anything but favorably disposed toward the integration, toward Sam Oney's coming. In fact, my recollection is they thought it just ridiculous that there would be such a fuss made about it.
I do remember that there was an assembly of law school graduates, an alumni senate or something, that voted not to support the integration of Mercer. These were graduates of Mercer's own law school at the time. That I thought was a little bit surprising too.
This context, I think, brought out probably the best and the worst of that issue. Many a pastor was forced from their pulpit right here in the Macon area.
Here at Mercer, I felt that the faculty really did strongly support black students being here and supported us and were willing to help us in any way they could.
Everybody was not on board, but you knew the people who were there with outreach arms. Everybody didn't understand this, but those that did, they were there for you, and you knew that.
Dean Hendricks and Mr. Bradley and some of the other leaders tried to have us to gather socially, like on Sunday evenings. He would have us to come to his home, and we would have tea parties and singing, and I played the piano a lot. And he would introduce me to, different people who he felt were more open-minded, and he felt was more lenient toward the black race.
The first day on campus, my first meal in the cafeteria, and I had made up my mind that I wasn't going to prejudge anybody. And so I picked up my tray of food and looked around where there were some students already seated, and walked up to them and said hello, and I set down my tray of food and proceeded to sit down. And it was almost as if it was on a cue, as if somebody signaled to them And one after the other, they picked up their trays and moved away.
My best friend at the time, a young man by the name of Larry Hicks, drove me to campus that day. And he said, it was funny, we drove up on campus and he said, well, here you are. He said, you want me to wait? I said, wait for what? You know, I mean, at that time we didn't have cell phones and all that fancy stuff. I said, if anything happens, there's nothing that I can do to come and find you. He said, well, I don't think anything's going to happen. I said, I don't think so either. I came during the spring and everything was fine. And there wasn't a whole lot of publicity, none of this police escorts and none of that. He put me out in front of the student center and I just walked right into my first classes.
Now, I feel that the atmosphere at this facility differed from others was due to the religious foundations of the school, and also to visionaries in the administration, and most notably for me, Dr. Joseph Hendricks, who labored very hard to implement the new policy.
Started taking classes. Some professors were indifferent. Others were treated me as just if I were just another student. But others were there were a few that were very, very ill at ease at having a black face in the classroom. And again, I didn't take offense at that.
Even if you hated the black race, you loved Otis Redding and you loved James Brown and you loved the Gladys Knight and the Pips. You loved that music. So all of us loved that music. So all of us tended to dance together, and then when you dance together, you sing together, and then the singing brought about, camaraderie. So that kind of all helped to ease that burden of integrating races, cultures.
"50 years from now, if things haven't made progress or if they've digressed, then it would be on our shoulders. So in order to make progress, we're going to have to actively do that. And that's going to come from making sure everyone is equal in the classroom, making sure everyone is equal out of the classroom in organizations, in job searches, and also it's going to be coming from using Mercer as kind of a catalyst for high school students and middle school students in the Macon area today.
When someone looks different than someone, you see someone has to go through a process of proving themselves, because everyone, whether you believe it or not, everyone judges a book by its cover. And whether that's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, people still do it. It's human nature in a sense. And so everyone looks at a person and they peg what they think their personality is going to be based on who they've been around that looks like that person. And so you see a lot of people being wary of talking to certain people or being friends with certain people. And then you see a lot of people having to earn that trust or earn that friendship more so than someone who looks similar to that person. So there are definitely racial barriers.
We can go 20, 30, 40 miles outside of Georgia and still see some of the same attitudes that we saw 50 years ago. But balancing that out, you could still go 40, 50 miles outside of Georgia and see some new attitudes in a positive way that have developed over the last 50 years. And that's encouraging to me.
When you walk around campus, it's obvious that a great deal of progress has been made. This is a very diverse community. When you look at the leadership of the university, we've got a diverse leadership team. One of our most outstanding senior vice presidents is a great African American leader. Our senior vice provost is African American. Tremendous progress in terms of makeup of the community, in terms of the leadership of the university. And I think that there's a great deal to be proud of in that respect. That doesn't mean that we don't have a long way to go, But I think there has been tremendous progress here at Mercer and in our society generally in those 50 years. I think that we'll probably still have challenges 50 years from now. I think part of this is built into human nature in a way that requires, constant work and thought. I do think that the generation that follows mine will do better than my generation has done, and I suspect that their children will do better than they've done. I think that there is progress, and I think the arc of history is towards greater racial justice.
We've been conditioned to think that differences are bad, but 50 years from now we might be able to condition ourselves that differences are good. So it all depends on our decisions that we make today.
When we can get to the point that we can accept people for who they are, for their strengths and their weakness, and just love them for with the good and the bad, and that, I think that's also part of our Christianity. I think we can really learn to love one another and learn to live together and care about one another and want the best for one another.
I believe that in the future we're going to have more deans of color. We don't have that right now. They may not be African American, they may be Asian Americans, or they may be Hispanics, but that's going to occur. And it has to happen. The demographics would dictate that it will happen. And we have to be prepared when that occurs. Because as I tell my students, one of the most tragic things in my mind is to have an opportunity but not be prepared to take advantage of it.
A number of the individuals featured in the video are with us today. Certainly their actions paved the way towards today's commemoration. I'd like to invite them to stand at this time and allow us to recognize and thank them. So the individuals who were interviewed in this video, would you all please stand? The university is blessed with a strong and principled board of trustees. David Hudson arrived at Mercer in the fall of 1964, became the president of the student body in 1968 before going on to Harvard Law School, and then he had the ultimate learning experience serving as a law clerk to Judge Griffin Bell, who at that time was on the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. David has since become a leading First Amendment lawyer and is completing his second term as chairman of the Mercer University Board of Trustees. At this time, I'd like to invite David to introduce our keynote speaker.
Our program is entitled Looking Back and Moving Forward. 50 years ago this day, I was a high school senior in a small Georgia town. There were less than 100 students in my senior class. At that point in my life, I had never shared one moment of education in a classroom with a black person. I had never worshiped with a black person. All around me, there was injustice, indignity, and unfairness under which our black citizens lived. But as the pastor said a moment ago, I was sitting on the sidelines. Yet a storm was brewing, and it would soon reach out and not only change this country and the world, it would change a small town Georgia white boy. Fueled by the courage, wisdom, determination, and divine guidance, particularly by black ministers with ties to Georgia, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Andrew Young, Reverend Ralph David Abernathy, Reverend Joseph Lowry, who are a few that come to mind, the South and the nation as a whole was on the brink of major changes. One place that was ready to change was Mercer University. The message of freedom for all and the biblical command to love thy neighbor as thyself resonated with President Rufus Harris, with Dean of Men and Students Joe Hendricks, with the faculty, and with a courageous majority of the Board of Trustees. Unlike the University of Georgia that required a federal court order, issued, by the way, by Judge Gus Boodle in Macon, a Mercer graduate, Mercer integrated voluntarily and against the express wishes of the leadership of the Georgia Baptist Convention. As a result, Sam Oney from Africa was admitted among the first black students. Unlike the University of Georgia, there were no ugly student protests here. Old Sam did encounter shut doors, primarily from a Baptist church that was located 50 yards from here, but no shut doors at Mercer University. By the time I got here the next year, having black students was no big deal. In fact, Sam Oney from Africa was a celebrity. For those of us who had never been out of Georgia, knowing somebody who was from another country was really a special thing. Mercer then added more black students each year. Those of us who were in the ROTC trained with our fellow cadets, many of those were black, and we jointly suffered the indignities of basic camp summer officer training at Fort Bragg. There we were neither black nor white. We were just college boys under the thumbs of the drill sergeants. This transformation of Mercer, the transformation of the lives of individual students, and the transformation of our society as a whole would not have happened without the extraordinary leadership of men and women like Ambassador Andrew Young. When you learn about the life of Ambassador Young, it is almost like watching the movie Forrest Gump. Like the fictional Forrest, played by Tom Hanks, the real-life Andrew Young has been at the forefront of much of the history made in this nation and this state for the last 50 years. Ambassador Young was born in New Orleans, where his mother was a school teacher and his father was a dentist. He obtained his undergraduate degree from Howard University and then earned a divinity degree from Hartford Seminary in Hartford, Connecticut. His first pastorate was at the Bethany Congregational Church in Thomasville, Georgia, in 1955. He, like Dr. King, became a follower of Gandhi's concept of nonviolence as a way to bring about equality and social change. In spite of threats to his own safety, he led African Americans to register to vote in Georgia and Alabama, and in so doing, he became a friend and trusted confidant of Dr. King. In 1961, Reverend Young and his wife moved to Georgia and Atlanta, where he served with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and became engaged full-time in the struggle for civil rights. In 1964, Reverend Young became the executive director of the conference and was one of the principal colleagues of Dr. King. Jailed on several occasions, Reverend Young was active in demonstrations and protests throughout the South, was at the 1963 March in Washington, and was with Dr. King in Memphis when he was assassinated in 1968. Yet the work of these American heroes led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and the Fair Housing Act in 1968. In 1972, Reverend Young was elected to the United States Congress from Atlanta and re-elected again in 2 subsequent elections. He became the first African American elected to Congress in Georgia since Reconstruction in the 1800s. In 1977, President Carter appointed Reverend Young to serve as United States Ambassador to the United Nations. He worked with President Carter to make human rights a central focus and bedrock of American foreign policy, along with economic development in third world countries. Ambassador Young was one of the first in the land to call for sanctions against the apartheid regime in South Africa. Ambassador Young's next undertaking was to run for and be elected mayor of Atlanta, which he did in 1981 and was reelected in 1985. One of his great gifts to our state was his leadership to bring the 1996 Olympic Games to Atlanta and his service as co-chair of the Atlanta Olympic Committee. Ambassador Young continues to serve others today as a college professor, a member and leader of nonprofit and civic institutions, and even as a board member of the Atlanta Falcons. Ambassador Young has been recognized with honorary degrees from over 100 universities here and across the globe. He is a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Ambassador Young has been and will be, until he draws his last breath, a champion for justice, for human rights, and economic opportunity. It is a great honor for this university to welcome Ambassador Young and to hear his remarks today. The Mercer Singers will be performing before Ambassador Young speaks, but let us all take this opportunity now to express our welcome and appreciation for the life and work of Ambassador Young and for his presence today.
Thank you very much. This 50 years of looking back and moving forward gives us a wonderful opportunity to be a little more objective, a little more balanced, and perhaps a lot more holistic in our views of the past 50 years. I was reading a book the other day by Nelson Mandela, and he and Ahmad Kathrada, the Indian gentleman who served 26 of his 27 years in jail with him, were having an argument. And they were trying to decide how they were going to overcome the breach between themselves and the people who put them in jail. And this was a serious problem for them. It wasn't enough to get out of jail. They were trying to establish a sense of brotherhood with the very persons who put them in jail. It happened to be the Minister Kruger, who was the Minister of Justice, who was as ornery and mean and racist as anybody we've ever known in the South of the United States, right along with some of the friends I just left down in St. Augustine with J.B. Stoner and Connie Lynch. And he was not concerned about getting even. He was concerned about getting reconciled. And I would think that that's our challenge still. Not to count up the score of who did what, when, why, to whom, and who deserves credit for this, that, and the other. It's probably only important for us to look backward in order to see clearly how to move forward. And Nelson Mandela and Ahmad Kathrada ended up inviting their jailers to sit with their families at his inauguration as the first president democratically elected in the Republic of South Africa. But it really bothered them that they couldn't reach Brother Kruger, as they called him. And they finally worked out a way where they found one of Kruger's friends who would stage a barbecue and not tell him they were coming. And they would show up, and they would find a way to reconcile. I happened to be at one of those reconciliation meetings in South Africa, and I was invited to a Thanksgiving service. And I thought it was like our Thanksgiving services, except it was on a football field, and there were about 10,000 people there. And 20 young men had been sentenced to death for treason. And they were the hosts of the Thanksgiving rally. And they had invited Bishop Desmond Tutu, who arranged for them to have attorneys who argued their case and got them reduced to life imprisonment. And of course, they thanked him. Then they got up and they thanked the defense attorneys who defended them pro bono. And finally, it came time for them to call up the prosecutor. And they thanked him. And along with him, they invited the judge who had sentenced them to death. I happened to be sitting next to the judge and his wife in the audience. And they had no idea why they were there. In fact, his wife told my wife that he was really afraid to come. But she said, but they invited us, so we should go. It's often our women who give us the courage to stand up and be strong and push us from behind. And when he stood up, they threw their arms around him and they thanked him. They said, that was the old South Africa. You were doing your job just as we were doing ours. We were trying to create a new South Africa. You were trying to hold on to the old. But if you had not done your job, we never would have had an opportunity to spend 10 years in Nelson Mandela University, which was their name for Robben Island Prison. And they understood that without any formal training, without the struggle, they would not be the governors. The governor of the richest province in South Africa was leading this ceremony. And it was clear that being in jail for 10 years with many of the most educated people in South Africa, of all classes and background, had been indeed an educational experience. And they were genuinely saying thank you. I think it's the only time I've been in a place of joy where 10,000 people were all crying together. Because it was joy that allowed them to celebrate a new South Africa and literally put the past behind them and say that you did the best that you could do and we did the best that we could do, and thank God we're able to come through this together and build a new South Africa. We need a bit more of that spirit. The interesting thing about the African experience to me is that it's not based on justice or recrimination. It's, as Bishop Tutu said in his book, no future without forgiveness. And so the future demands more than justice. It demands an appreciation of God's grace and an extension of God's mercy. Because, as they said in Rwanda, where over 1 million people killed each other in about 3 months' time, and they were all black. 95% of them were Roman Catholics. And yet it was probably the worst slaughter in modern times. And yet when they got through it, the leadership said, we must put this behind us. We can't blame anybody. Whenever we point a finger at one, there are 4 or 5 fingers pointing back at the others. And so the healing requires mercy. And mercy comes from understanding. Now, I was blessed to learn that at 4 years old. By no fault of my own, my parents lived in the middle of a block in New Orleans, 1 block off Canal Street. On one corner, there was an Irish grocery store. On the next corner, there was an Italian bar. On the third corner, there was the headquarters of the Nazi Party. And I lived in the middle. And my babysitter aunt lived right behind the Deutsche Haus where the Nazi Party was meeting, and there was no air conditioning, so the windows were open. So at 3 and 4 years old, every Saturday when my parents would drop me off if they were going out somewhere, I was hearing people howl Hitler. and singing Deutschland über alles and spouting themes of white supremacy that I didn't understand. But my father took me to the movies to see the 1936 Olympics. And when Jesse Owens won his first race, in a sense, he was defeating the notion of white supremacy. And so Hitler got up and walked out. And my father pointed out, you see, Jesse didn't get mad. He just buckled down and won 3 more gold medals and setting a total of 4 world records. And he said, you don't ever get angry and upset with white supremacists. He said, white supremacy is a sickness. They don't know any better. And you don't get mad with sick people. You find ways to help them. And without ever using the word nonviolence, he always said, look, your mind is the most powerful weapon you have. And if you get emotional and angry, you turn off your mind. And the blood flows to your fists and your feet, and you either have to run or fight. He said, don't ever turn off your mind. And we grew up in that neighborhood without much friction. The friction I had was when I had to go to a segregated school in another neighborhood where everybody was black and where I was the only one that had lunch money. And the problems of class and race were part of coming to me with my mother's milk, which in our family by the time I was 6 was Coca-Cola. But to find a way to get along with people who were poor, who resented my privileges and the fact that my parents had education that they didn't have, was where I became a diplomat. And when I was about to flunk out of school, learning how to be a man, I thought, I met a young fellow who had been put out of school with me in 3rd grade. And I asked him where he'd been. He said, my mother was a maid. She made $1 a day plus car fare. When they put us out, she couldn't come back to school to see about me because she'd have to miss a day of work. So I never went back to school. And I said, well, where have you been? He said, I've been in just about every reform school, prison, and penitentiary in the state of Louisiana. And he said, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm thinking about dropping out of school because I'm not doing well. He cussed me up and down and backwards. And it was obvious, he didn't have to say it, that he was every bit as smart, if probably smarter, because he had survived the prison system in Louisiana, and even though he was a drug addict, he was still very, very sharp, and lectured me on the folly of wasting an opportunity to get an education. He said, anybody can go to the Army, but not everybody has the opportunity that you have to get an education. And so my childhood, my life, has been a struggle to reconcile the polarities, not just of my life, but the polarities of my life happen to be the polarities of our planet. In Syria, they're all Muslims practically. They're Shiite, Sunni, Alawite. They've been fighting, killing each other for 1,500 years. Over what? Nobody's really sure anymore. But the world cannot survive unless we can bring the world together. Now, in a strange way, as I was experiencing my upbringing in Louisiana, James Earl Carter was experiencing a rather similar upbringing in South Georgia. He was born in a county that was 80% black. His grandfather used to sit on the porch with an AME bishop and read the Bible and sing hymns. His mother was the county nurse who delivered all of the babies and considered them all her children. And she went to the Peace Corps in India at 66 years old. And though his father, he said, was a hard-nosed conservative that got mad every time his black friends came to the house, he never made a fuss with his mother because she considered all of them her children. I was with President Carter in Nigeria when he stood up to read the Old Testament lesson in a First Baptist church in Lagos. And he said the first time that he heard about Nigeria was when the Baptist Youth Missionary Training Program had a car wash to raise money to send books to a little school in Nigeria. When President Obasanjo got up to read the New Testament scripture, he said, "Mr. President, I want to thank you for sending books to that little Baptist mission school. That was where I got my primary education." And he went on to get an engineering degree and to be the most distinguished student of the British Commonwealth in all of their military training, and the president of Nigeria. I say all of this because the roots of our Judeo-Christian heritage have planted all of these seeds all over the world. And God does not scatter seeds without purpose. And we have to learn to come together and live together and work together and develop a social order that is fair to each and everybody. Simply because if we don't do it, there's nobody else in the world that can. Arnold Toynbee talked about slaves from Africa being brought to America for a special purpose, and that if America was going to move beyond the values and culture of Europe, it was going to be the infusion of some kind of cultural spirituality from the peoples of Africa in these United States of America that create a new concept of socio-spiritual order that enables us to embrace all humankind. Now, this is not a matter of choice. This is a matter of necessity. When we developed the cell phone and the television set, and when we learned how to transfer money electronically all over the planet, whether we believe it or not, this is one world. And I don't even know the physical terminology, though I took physics 50 years ago, 60 years ago. Nothing they taught me exists anymore. But The so-called Arab Spring happened because a man with a pushcart could not get a license to sell his wares in Tunisia. And he kept getting turned away. He was the same color as the man in the office, probably similar tribe. Tunisia is not a very diverse society, and everybody's pretty much the same except rich and poor. And the government bureaucrat had no respect for the peddler with a pushcart, and he kept sending him away without a permit. And in desperation, he doused himself with a bottle of gasoline and set himself on fire. Normally, that wouldn't be a problem in the world of my childhood. But there must have been 25 people with cell phones and cameras that took pictures of him and put it on the internet. And within a matter of minutes, half of the world in the Middle East was identifying with the man in the pushcart who really didn't want democracy. They're not telling us the truth in Washington. He didn't want democracy. He wanted a job. He wanted to work. He wanted to feed his family. Egypt is not about democracy. Egypt is about jobs. And if you want to know where we go in the future and how we move forward, I recommend that you read a little book by Jim Clifton, The Coming Jobs War. Jim Clifton runs Gallup polls, and they poll 150 countries every month. And what he says is for the last 5 years, nobody's interested in the environment, nobody's interested in peace, nobody's interested in democracy. The thing that comes up all over in 150 countries, in almost everybody they talk to, is jobs. And so this brings us, whether we realize it or not, right to where Martin Luther King was when he died. He had done a good job with racism, and we had made significant progress with war. You might not think so, but 60-some million people were killed in the Second World War. And that's a long difference from 5,000 or less in Afghanistan or 10,000 or so in Iraq. And of course, that's only accounting the Americans, but still that's progress. But the development of an economy that allows people all over the world to have jobs is what we're going to be asked about when we get to heaven. They're not going to ask you whether you went to church. They're not going to ask you how many degrees you had. They'll say, did you feed the hungry? Did you clothe the naked? Did you heal the sick? And they're not going to ask whether it was Obamacare or private care or whatever care. Did the sick have a place to go when they were sick? And inasmuch as we have done it unto the least of these, my brethren, Jesus says, you've done it unto me. Now that's the challenge. And you know, I couldn't quite talk this way at a big state university, maybe University of Georgia, or Georgia State even. But there's something about the small, religious, liberal arts college that has been the maintainer of our values and vision from the beginning of this country. It's no accident that Martin Luther King came out of Morehouse. And, but even coming out of Morehouse, or me out of Howard, if we had not married two little girls from the country in Perry County, Alabama, which is in itself an interesting county. And Juanita Abernathy, Gene Young, and Coretta King all came out of Perry County, Alabama. It was one of the counties that was probably the meanest in Alabama, but it had one of the best schools in the South. And Julian Bond's father did his doctoral dissertation on Perry County. And he found that in the 1940s, this small religious missionary school, Teachers College, Lincoln Normal, had produced more black PhDs from that county than any state in the Union, North or South. That there were missionaries, young people like yourselves, who didn't just go out into the world to make money, but went to the worst place in the South to teach. And just by accident, they were Quakers. And they taught Gene and Coretta and Juanita about nonviolence. Now, Martin was at Boston University, and I was at Hartford Theological Seminary, and we were talking about the theology of Europe and the just war and Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich and the guilt of America for not standing up to Hitler early enough. But these little girls went to Antioch, where the Women's Strike for Peace was started, or Manchester College, where Gene had to take a required course in New Testament nonviolence as a freshman. And so when we married and came back here, our wives were probably better prepared than we were. And in the first confrontation that I had with the Klan, we came around the curve between Albany, Georgia, and Thomasville in a little town called Doe Run, Georgia, just outside of Moultrie. And Maynard Jackson's grandfather had asked me to run a voter registration drive, and I didn't think there was anything wrong with that. And I said, sure. He also said, we want you to vote Republican, and I didn't know about that. But he said very quickly, he said, no, you voted Democrat in Connecticut, but if Eisenhower wins, we will get some of the best white folks as judges, because we will have some opportunity to nominate them in the old black and tan Republican Party. But if Stevenson wins, though you might like him better, Richard Russell will name the judges with Senator Eastland from Mississippi. Well, they got my attention and I voted Republican. But before that drive started, when I came around the corner, I felt that this was a first challenge that would determine my ministry. And my wife was a very good shot as a country girl. And I said, baby, if they come to our house, I'm going to go down and talk to them. But I want you to sit in the window with the rifle. And I want you to point the rifle at the guy that I'm talking to. And then I will be in a position to reason with him as a brother from a position of strength. And this crazy country girl says, no. I said, no what? She said, I'm not going to point a gun at a human being. I said, that's not a human being, that's the Ku Klux Klan. She said, if you think that, you need to quit preaching now and go do something else. She said, don't you ever forget that under that sheet is the heart of a child of God. And so, we were caught up in a network, black and white, that yes, it was racist and political. Yes, it was filled with hate and insecurity. But it was also filled with faith. And when we sang our hymns in church, we may have sang them at a different meter and a different key. But they were the same hymns. And when we went to dinner, first time I went to dinner in an integrated cafeteria, I thought they'd prepared the menu just for me, because it was everything we liked. And then I realized all of a sudden, I was already out of seminary, I just realized that colored folk and white folk eat the same food every day. We sing the same hymns, we read the same Bible, we work side by side. And in spite of the legal separations, there have always been spiritual bonds that have made it impossible for us to completely separate. And it was building on those traditions. In fact, her refusal to point the gun was what laid the foundation for my understanding how nonviolence really could work. Because she was not going to touch a gun. And so I had to think, which my daddy told me in the first place. And I went to Mr. Watt at Watt's hardware store, because he was the mayor. And I said, Mr. Watt, there's a group of Klansmen out there. And I said, I'm afraid they're coming to Thomasville to harass us for our voter registration meeting, which starts tomorrow. He got on the phone and he called Sunnyland Packing Company and Flowers Bakery. And they decided that the Klan could meet at the courthouse, but it couldn't parade through the black community. And that we could have our voter registration drive without any obstructions. And it was the business leaders that essentially were the determining factor. And so when we come to Atlanta, it's the business leaders in the black community making progress before the state legislature to this day. When we went to Birmingham, 100 business leaders signed an agreement to end segregation in their facilities. They would take down all the signs, they would hire people on the basis of their qualifications, and at first they said, but we can't find anybody qualified. And we said, ask your wives who they go to when they want to find something in your store. They don't go to the little girls that have just been there for 6 weeks from Alabama and Auburn. They go to the maids who've been there for the last 10 years. They know more about your business than your assistant managers do and your managers. So all you have to do is put them in the dresses that they sell instead of these funny uniforms, and they will be better sales clerks than you can ever find, and they will be there for years and years, and they will improve your business. And so the business leaders agreed, and segregation came to an end in Birmingham a full year before the Congress acted in Washington. And I made that statement in New York a few years later when I was in Congress, and Harry Oppenheimer of South Africa came up to me and said, do you think that would work in South Africa? I said, certainly it would. You get the business leaders, and racial strife and violence is bad for business. And if we're going to have business, if we're going to create jobs, we've got to figure out a way to stop the fighting and learn how to get along. And business leaders are more likely to do that than politicians. Not that they're any better, but they're more vulnerable. You shift their margins 5% and they're in trouble. You got to change the Congress. You got to get a 60% change to make the Congress change, or the Georgia legislature. So the opportunity that comes out of the South that we took to South Africa and that we have taken to Latin America and almost anywhere in the world where there's peace and prosperity, there is a functioning free enterprise system that is inclusive. That's why we have to have, democracy cannot work without a free enterprise system. And so when you have an inclusive economy, democracy is relatively easy. And so we have been thriving here in Georgia because in spite of the things that we're saying about each other, in spite of the things that go on in the legislature, in spite of the things that happen, the incidents that happen, the fundamental structure of our society is a system of democracy and free enterprise based on a Judeo-Christian heritage that is inclusive of people who have come here from almost everywhere. I'm sure most of the Koreans who came here at one time had been Buddhist. They're all Presbyterians now. And to make the world make sense, what's happening at this institution is developing a value system that is exportable, that you must take with you, whether you go as a teacher, a scientist, a politician, a business person, because almost everywhere people need to learn what we have learned. And the irony is that we cannot be free until Africa is free. And I say that not ideological, that free enterprise needs an expanding market. The market in Europe is saturated. The market in Latin America has reached its potential largely. Mostly. It's going to change when the Panama Canal opens up. Japan is in a recession. China is having trouble. India has reached certain limits. And the only place that's totally undeveloped happens to be maybe the richest continent on the planet, and that is the African continent. People in Zimbabwe, when they got their land back, they wondered why the white people wouldn't give them the land, because the white people had plenty of land. But when they started plowing up the ground to plant seeds, and they began to find these little flaky things that turned out to be alluvial diamonds. And so they got a diamond industry where they thought they were planting corn. And they dug a little deeper and they found something called lithium. And all of our cell phones and everything need a lithium iode battery. And everything, the richest continent on the planet is over there in Africa. And if we don't learn how to work together as brothers and sisters here, we're not going to be able to find a way to include them in a global economy. The Chinese are not doing it. And so we've come a long way, but it's been a lot easier than any of us thought it would be. We can still remember the names of the people who shed their blood. Not so in the rest of the world. And so we in the United States of America still have the best opportunity to develop democracy, free enterprise, and a forgiving, merciful social order that allows people to live together as brothers and sisters, as Dr. King said, rather than perish as fools. God bless you.
Thank you, Ambassador Young, for your message. It's a message that I think is especially pertinent to many of the challenges we face in our community. Thank you for honoring us with your presence. I'd like Ambassador Young and David Hudson to join me at the podium for just a moment. I suppose the last thing Ambassador Young needs is to be honored again, but you would honor this university greatly by allowing us to confer an honorary degree upon you in recognition of your lifetime. So, Ambassador Young, having proven yourself most deserving of being honored by this university today, and by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Board of Trustees of the university, it is my great honor and privilege to hereby confer upon you the degree Doctor of Humanities, in token of which we present to you this hood and this citation. We'll take a picture right here, and then I'll have somebody take it. Thank you all for being here. This is an occasion that's very meaningful for the university, and I'm grateful for your presence to help us with this commemoration. And again, Ambassador Young, thank you again for making this such a special occasion for us. If you would now please stand as Dr. Marilyn Mendinghall, Senior Vice Provost for Administration, pronounces our benediction. Following the benediction, please remain in place for the musical response.
Let us pray. Heavenly Father, this point in time marks the end of the opening convocation, but the beginning of our reflection of a nation and a university 50 years ago, the beginning of our assessment of Mercer in this present age, and our move toward a planned future once expressed in a dream. We come with thankful hearts for a Mercer community that today sees the importance of sharing and celebrating this aspect of the Mercer story. We are thankful to those who were young and old, black and white, Mercer and Macon, who cared about issues of injustice, who had hopes and dreams of their own, and who became men and women of action. Let us all be ever mindful that action begins with a step. That step soon turns into a walk, and that walk a run. Dr. King spoke of the fierce urgency of now. May each of us move swiftly to esteem others. Now is the time to be concerned for not merely our own interests, but for the interests of others. May we seek to encourage others, to strengthen them and build them up. May we talk to one another and in earnest seek to know others who are different from us and to begin to recognize them as our brothers and sisters. We ask for your blessing as we look back, move forward, and celebrate. Please order our steps and guide our feet to your glory. Amen.